President welcomed the airstrikes and statement that he issued earlier today, saying he hopes that this will encourage the parties to honor the obligations that they have had imposed upon them by the United Nations and move quickly to some type of reconciliation.
U.S. warplanes take aim on Bosnia in a NATO airstrike. Hello, I'm Terry Anzur. It was a warning to the Bosnian Serbs to stop the shelling of innocent civilians in Sarajevo. American fighter jets, along with Spanish, Dutch, and French warplanes, were gunning for an ammunition dump near Pale. U.S. officials were quick to speak out in support of the air raids, but Defense Secretary William Perry was just as quick to state that American troops won't be drawn into the fighting. Chris?
Thank you, Terry. I'm Chris Matthews in Washington. The news that American jets are conducting bombing raids in Europe will strike many Americans as odd. 50 years after D-Day, 50 years after VE Day, I should say, 6 years after the end of the Iron Curtain, most people sitting in their homes right now will wonder why Americans have been drawn into yet another European war. No U.S. casualties yet, no U.S. captives yet. But the first one of either will be more than most Americans have counted on, more than President Clinton has sold them on. Terry?
Chris, we'll begin with the aftermath of today's NATO airstrikes in Bosnia. Also, during the next 2 hours, we invite our viewers to call us and discuss these top stories. An avalanche of amendments on Capitol Hill as the Senate votes on balancing the budget. Then, the veto power of the president. Will Bill Clinton use it to block spending cuts at home and abroad? And more on the courtroom fireworks in the O.J. Simpson trial as the jury gets its first look at the bloody socks. We'll also have an in-depth interview with John Hume, a key player in the Northern Ireland peace process. But first, U.S. officials speak out in support of the NATO airstrikes in Bosnia. Joining us from the NBC News Washington Bureau is NBC News Channel reporter Sandy Gilmore. Hello, Sandy.
Hello, Terry. Good afternoon.
What is the reaction in Washington tonight to this latest NATO airstrike with U.S. warplanes taking a prominent role?
Well, at the State Department particularly, and of course at the White House, officials are thrilled that this has occurred, but they've been extremely frustrated over the last several weeks with the UN recalcitrance in ordering up airstrikes, even as the Serbs continue to thumb their noses at that exclusion zone around Sarajevo, and many more people have died from shelling and from sniper fire.
Is there a feeling that this airstrike did any good? I mean, we know it sent a message, but do we have any indications that the Bosnian Serbs are listening?
The first indication was that actually that the Serbs retaliated and continued shelling, and that they actually went into one or two of the compounds where heavy weapons were supposed to be secured in strict defiance of the UN guards who were guarding those compounds, and actually fired off a few mortars from those compounds. Now, what will come of that, we don't know. The big danger right now is that the Serbs may decide to take some of the UN peacekeepers, who for the most part are U.S. allies, British and French troops on the ground there, hostage. And if that happens, the whole thing could escalate.
Sandy, I got to ask you about the politics of this. Is there any support or any attempt by the president and his people to get out the word that we're involved? I mean, this, I think, will strike a lot of viewers who follow the news generally. Are we still there? Is that still going on?
Well, it certainly has been in the back burner, and today I think the main person to speak for the administration today, I felt, was really the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Saakashvili. And the big question was, well, is this a turning point? Because finally the head of the United Nations civilian forces there, Yasushi Akashi, who's been the one who keeps refusing to order in or ask for the NATO airstrikes, finally he came around, and the question is this a turning point now? And Saakashvili cautioned people in his news conference today against thinking that way. So I think, Chris, it really politically, they aren't telling the American people, look, we could be getting into this deeper. And I think they just hope that a few more of these airstrikes will bring the Serbs around to get back into negotiations, which right now are just dead in the water.
Well, Sandy Gilmore, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on the very latest from Washington on the situation in Bosnia tonight. Let's go to Bosnia-Herzegovina right now and hear from Tim Deagle of NBC News. He joins us live over the telephone from Sarajevo, and we know these phone lines can be problematic, but Tim, I hope you can hear us.
I can hear you, Terry. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you as well. And let us understand a little bit about how the airstrike is being received where you are.
Well, we heard that the airstrikes had taken place. We couldn't actually see them because it's outside the city at around 4 o'clock this afternoon. The streets emptied within the city quite quickly, and everyone went inside or into shelters. Everyone was expecting a reaction from the Serbs. That seems to be the way this game is played, and indeed it came a bit later on with shelling, as the previous correspondent was saying, mortars landing inside the city and on some of the front lines. Amazingly, we didn't see a great deal of casualties like we saw yesterday because most people were inside, and I can confirm that those weapons were fired from weapons collection points, which are supposed to be under UN control. That didn't seem to make a difference. It seems the Serbs are very angry. Their reaction is one of being more belligerent rather than taking a message that we hoped they would take. And the city is once again under attack. The hotel where I am staying is close to one of the front lines, and as we speak, I can hear anti-aircraft guns, mortars, and cannons firing off outside the window. So it does not seem that the Serbs are willing to take this lying down. Terry.
Well, the question, I suppose, is have there been any casualties on the Serbian side? Have U.S. planes inflicted any deaths or injuries?
Well, we have no information about that. Pale, where the Bosnian Serb leadership is based, is not very willing to give us any kind of information. In fact, we're only 20 kilometers away, but in fact it takes us 5 days via 3 countries to get, and also permission to get there. So we're dependent on them, and so far we've heard no reports of casualties. It was a military target. The NATO commander is saying that the target was hit. We saw pictures coming from the local television station in that town, and all we saw is people running with the sound of sirens in the background, but we have heard no reports of casualties.
What kind of treatment do UN fighter pilots or bombing pilots get if they're captured from the Serbs? Have we had any experience with that yet?
We haven't. There was one British NATO pilot who was shot down over Garage Day last year, and he actually bailed out of his aircraft after he was hit by surface-to-air missiles, which were fired by the Serbs on a bombing run, and he landed on the Bosnian side, and he was very quickly repatriated and back to his unit. So we haven't seen that. What we did see last year was after airstrikes and after this kind of NATO response led by the American government, we saw as many as 200 UN personnel on the ground, Canadians, British, and French, taken hostage by the Serbs to force the UN into doing what they wanted to do when we'd basically seen action when we were trying to make them do what NATO wanted to do.
Is there a feeling there, Tim, that the United States is really not serious about stopping this conflict because we have not been willing to make the commitment to send in troops ourselves?
That is a very, it's a good question, but a very difficult question to answer. The U.S. is seen as the leader of NATO and those who will act the strongest. And in some ways, ironically, having British and French troops on the ground here for over 3 years now, the Americans are seen as the great hope by the Bosnian people, and to which, you know, the last government perhaps that the Bosnian people are looking to for some kind of lead. But putting troops on the ground, as someone put it to me today, if you want me to fight a conflict here in Bosnia, give me a green helmet and a green suit and green cars. Don't give me a blue helmet and white cars, because that is not our job.
Okay, thank you. Hang on the line from Sarajevo, Tim. Joining me here in the studio is John Steinbrunner, who's Director of Foreign Policy Studios at the Studies at the Brookings Institution, and from our New York City Bureau, Charles Kupchan, who's Senior Fellow for European Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Starting with you, Mr. Steinbrunner, quickly, what's your take on what happened? What's it mean?
I think it's serious trouble because it's the beginning of the potential breakdown of the situation. The airstrikes are very unlikely to be decisive.
You wouldn't have recommended them?
Well, under the circumstances, NATO or the UN got itself into a position of having threatened them. They had to go through with them. But it's a failure of policy, and I think we should recognize that we do not have a formula for resolving this.
Mr. Kupchan, what's your take?
I would take a different view on that. I think it's a welcome and long overdue response to Serb attacks on Sarajevo. But I would say this, that either we should take a strategy in which we retaliate across the board for attacks on Sarajevo and other safe areas, or we should get out. But we have made a commitment to protect civilians in certain cities and areas of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I would like to see this retaliation strategy strengthened over the next weeks.
Well, we have a sharp difference of opinion here among our experts, and after a break, it is your chance to join the conversation and sound off on the NATO airstrikes today in Bosnia. What do you think the American role in this conflict should be? Call us with your opinion at 1-800-988-TALK. We'll be back with all of our guests right after this.
This is America's Talking.
This program is sponsored by Whirlpool Appliances. Whirlpool, how to make a home run.
Tonight on Straightforward, get a fresh look at world politics with special guest host Geraldine Ferraro. First, activist Bianca Jagger tells how she's taking a stand for human rights around the world. Then navigate the national government with former Congressman Tony Colo. Tonight on Straightforward.
Tomorrow on Wake Up, America.
We'll find out what veterans talk about on Memorial Day.
Plus, we'll help Atlanta build their Olympic Stadium and a can't-miss holiday movie review from our own Jerry.
On Wake Up, America with Bill McCuddy and Kay Kim. Your father could win the adventure of a lifetime in the Have a Heart Father's Day contest. He'll transform into a secret agent at the Casa de Campo Resort in the exotic Caribbean on a 5-day fantasy vacation from International Espionage Tours and American Airlines. Mail us a letter and photo, and in 100 words or less, explain why your father should win. Our staff will select the winner based on originality, style, and overall content. All entries must be received by Friday, June 9, 1995.
Lots of stuff to put away? Duplicating yourself could help. So could Whirlpool. Introducing the most flexible refrigerator in America. With shelves that slide and bins that move, we adjust to you. And if that isn't creative enough, Whirlpool also invented this. The first sliding freezer floor. Perfect. Now everything's in place and together. Because you and Whirlpool know how to make a home run.
See Jane work on plane.
For one specific airstrike in response to non-compliance with a specific UNPRO 4 directive. It does not represent in any way a widening of the conflict or a particular change in the response by NATO or UNPRO 4. After all, we have conducted airstrikes in the past.
Welcome back to America's Talking in Depth as we discuss today's NATO airstrikes against the Bosnian Serbs. We're taking your calls at 1-800-988-TALK. If you'd like to join us right now on Prodigy, here's how to do it. Jump to chat and go to the America's Talking area. Today's password is strikes. Now back to our discussion. You know, watching the news today, catching the news reports, it's like picking up a book I've left on my shelf a year ago and haven't gotten past the first chapter. Here we are in chapter 2. Let's try to bring us up to date so our viewers and myself in particular, maybe Terry as well, what has been happening in that war theater the last several months?
Well, there's been a ceasefire in effect till the beginning of May. And on the supposition that there was going to be a political settlement. But the formula for settling the agreement is just not in sight, and both sides are maneuvering now to renew the fighting and put pressure on the other. That's basically
so nothing has gelled in terms of both sides accepting the lines?
No.
Mr. Kupchan, how do you see the developments of the last several months leading up to today's incident?
I would agree with that basic description, and the reason that I support airstrikes is that the Serbs are the one party that need an incentive to move towards some sort of territorial resolution. They hold the cards, and by carrying out airstrikes, we increase the costs of their continued policy of aggression.
Do we have a clearly delineated mission, both of you gentlemen? Is this one of those murky situations where we're trying to make the best of a terribly murky situation, or do we have a clear map we'd like to see come out of this, Mr. Kupchan?
Well, there is a map that the contact group has put forward. It's not one that the Serbs are yet willing to sign off on. And I think what's happened over the last few weeks is that, number one, the attacks on Sarajevo have increased, and also there has been talk in Britain and France of withdrawing UNPRO 4, and that has increased the desire.
What is UNPRO 4?
UNPRO 4 are the UN troops or the British, French, other
Right,
troops
the
under
ground
UN
forces.
command that are delivering humanitarian assistance.
That's
They're
about
the ones that have been opposing
20,000 people in forces in blue helmets. Part of that. That is the UN force, which is basically in the middle of all this. Terry?
Well, isn't this also a seasonal type of fighting? Because the winter in that part of the world is just brutal. Everybody seems to put their weapons away during the wintertime. Now it's spring again, and they're shelling Sarajevo. It almost seems like they're in a depressing